Hey there, fellow curious minds. Picture this. It's the height of the Cold War. America just got humiliated by a Soviet satellite beeping its way across the sky, and some genius in the Pentagon goes, "You know what would fix this? Let's build an entire city underneath a glacier, with a nuclear reactor, in Greenland. What could possibly go wrong?" And honestly, a lot went wrong. Today we're cracking open one of the wildest classified projects in American history, Camp Century, a fully functional underground base buried 30 meters beneath the Greenland ice sheet. We're talking tunnels, barracks, a chapel, hot showers, and yes, a portable nuclear reactor that had never been tested before they switched it on for the first time, right there in the ice. Oh, and the whole thing was just a cover story for an even crazier plan involving thousands of kilometers of secret tunnels packed with nuclear missiles. You can't make this stuff up. So before we dig into this frozen fever dream of Cold War paranoia, smash that like button if you're into stories that sound like rejected Bond villain plots, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I want to know who's joining me on this journey into America's most ambitious frozen mistake. All right, let's get into it. Now, to understand why the United States decided that building an underground city beneath a massive glacier was somehow a reasonable idea, we need to rewind to October 1957. This was the moment when America's carefully constructed image as the world's technological superpower came crashing down like a house of cards in a hurricane. And the instrument of this humiliation, a polished metal sphere about the size of a beach ball, weighing less than 200 pounds, quietly beeping its way across the night sky. The Soviets called it Sputnik, and it changed everything. Picture the scene in Washington when the news broke. American politicians, military brass and scientists had spent years reassuring themselves and the public that the Soviet Union was technologically inferior, a nation of peasants who could barely keep the lights on in Moscow. Sure, the Soviets had nuclear weapons, but everyone assumed that was mostly luck and stolen secrets. The real innovation, the cutting-edge stuff, that was supposed to be America's domain. Then Sputnik appeared overhead, visible to anyone with a pair of binoculars, broadcasting a simple radio signal that might as well have been saying, "Hello, capitalists, how's the view from down there?" The psychological impact was devastating. Americans could literally go outside, look up at the stars and watch Soviet technology pass over their heads every 96 minutes. Not exactly great for national morale. The response in the United States bordered on mass hysteria. Newspapers ran apocalyptic headlines about Soviet domination of space. Politicians demanded answers. How had this happened? Who was responsible? The Eisenhower administration found itself in the uncomfortable position of trying to explain why a country they had consistently dismissed as backward had just achieved something the United States could not. President Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man who had led the Allied forces to victory in World War II and was not exactly prone to panic, tried to downplay the significance. It was just a small satellite, he argued, a scientific curiosity rather than a military threat. The American public was not buying it. And then, just to twist the knife a little deeper, the Soviets did it again. In November 1957, less than a month after Sputnik 1, they launched Sputnik 2. This time the satellite was not alone. Aboard was a small dog named Laika, a former stray from the streets of Moscow who had been selected for a journey that would make her the first living creature to orbit the Earth. The propaganda value was immense. While America was still scrambling to figure out how to get anything into orbit, the Soviet Union was already sending passengers. Granted, the passenger was a dog, and the mission was essentially a one-way trip since the technology to bring Laika back safely did not exist yet, but those details got somewhat lost in the headlines. The message was clear. The Soviets were not just keeping pace with American technology, they were sprinting ahead. Now here is where the story takes a turn toward the tragicomic. The United States, desperate to restore some national pride, rushed to launch its own satellite. The vehicle chosen for this historic mission was the Vanguard rocket, a slender white missile that was supposed to carry a tiny satellite into orbit and prove that America was still in the game. On December 6, 1957, with television cameras rolling and the entire world watching, Vanguard lifted off from Cape Canaveral. It rose about 4 feet into the air, lost thrust, collapsed back onto the launch pad, and exploded in a spectacular fireball that destroyed both the rocket and any remaining American dignity. The satellite, which had been thrown clear of the explosion, was later found nearby, still beeping pathetically among the wreckage. The press had a field day. Headlines called it Flopnik, Kaputnik, and Stayputnik. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev publicly offered American technical assistance, which was basically the Cold War equivalent of your rival offering to help you parallel park after you just crashed into a fire hydrant. The Vanguard disaster was not just embarrassing, it was strategically terrifying. If the Soviets could put satellites into orbit, the reasoning went, they could put nuclear warheads into orbit too. Suddenly, the comfortable geographical buffer that had always protected the continental United States seemed to vanish. America was surrounded by two vast oceans that had historically made invasion nearly impossible. But oceans do not matter much when your enemy can drop weapons from space. The entire calculus of national defense had shifted overnight, and military planners were scrambling to adapt. President Eisenhower understood that the situation required more than just catching up in the space race. The real concern was nuclear deterrence. The United States had built its Cold War strategy around the threat of massive retaliation. If the Soviet Union ever attacked, America would respond with overwhelming nuclear force, destroying the USSR even if it meant mutual annihilation. This strategy only worked, however, if the Soviets believed that America could actually deliver that retaliation, and therein lay the problem. American nuclear weapons were primarily delivered by long-range bombers, aircraft that had to fly thousands of miles to reach Soviet targets. If the Soviets could track and shoot down those bombers, or worse, destroy them on the ground before they even took off, the entire deterrent would collapse. What America needed was a way to get nuclear weapons closer to Soviet territory, positioned where they could strike quickly and could not be easily eliminated in a first strike. This is where geography becomes crucial. Pull out a globe and trace a line from the continental United States to Moscow. If you follow the shortest path, the great circle route that aircraft and missiles would actually travel, you will notice something interesting. That line does not go across the Atlantic Ocean, as you might expect from looking at a flat map. Instead, it curves north, passing directly over the Arctic. And sitting right in the middle of that Arctic route, like a frozen aircraft carrier anchored between the superpowers, is the world's largest island, Greenland. Greenland had been on American military radar since World War II, when the United States established weather stations and supply bases on the island to support Atlantic convoys. After the war, as tensions with the Soviet Union escalated, the strategic value of this frozen territory became increasingly apparent. Greenland was Danish territory, technically part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but Denmark was a small nation with limited resources and even more limited ability to defend such a vast and remote possession. The island itself was almost entirely covered by an ice sheet up to 3 kilometers thick, with a tiny population of indigenous Inuit communities and Danish administrators clinging to the rocky coastline. In terms of permanent settlement, Greenland made Antarctica look crowded, but for military planners studying maps and calculating missile trajectories, Greenland was pure gold. A base in northern Greenland would be roughly equidistant from Washington and Moscow, perfectly positioned for early warning radar systems that could detect incoming Soviet bombers or missiles while there was still time to respond. It would also be an ideal launching point for American aircraft or missiles heading in the other direction. The frozen wasteland that made Greenland so inhospitable to human habitation also made it incredibly difficult for Soviet forces to attack or monitor. You cannot exactly sneak an invasion fleet through Arctic pack ice without someone noticing. The Eisenhower administration moved quickly. In 1951, the United States and Denmark signed a defense agreement that gave America the right to establish military installations on Greenland. The Danes, who were NATO allies and understood the threat posed by Soviet expansion, agreed to the arrangement despite some domestic controversy about allowing foreign troops on what they considered sovereign Danish soil. The flagship of this new American presence would be Thule Air Base, constructed on the northwestern coast of Greenland about 750 miles north of the Arctic Circle. And when we say constructed, we mean constructed in a hurry. The military wanted Thule operational as quickly as humanly possible, and they threw resources at the project on a scale that would make modern defense contractors weep with envy. The construction of Thule Air Base was one of the largest engineering projects ever attempted in the Arctic. Over the course of a single summer in 1951, more than 12,000 workers descended on the frozen coastline and built, essentially from nothing, a fully functional military installation capable of supporting heavy bomber operations. They constructed runways long enough to handle the massive B-36 Peacemaker bombers that formed the backbone of America's nuclear strike force. They built hangars, barracks, fuel storage facilities, radar installations, and all the infrastructure needed to keep thousands of personnel alive and operational in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The scale was staggering. Ships delivered hundreds of thousands of tons of equipment and supplies. Aircraft flew in personnel and specialized materials. Workers operated around the clock, taking advantage of the endless Arctic summer daylight to work in continuous shifts. The speed of construction came at a cost, though not one that was widely publicized at the time. The site chosen for Thule Air Base happened to be located near the traditional hunting grounds of a small Inuit community called the Inuguit. When the Americans arrived with their bulldozers and construction crews, the Danish authorities decided that the presence of indigenous people so close to a sensitive military installation was inconvenient. In 1953, the community was forcibly relocated, given just a few days to pack their belongings and move to a new settlement about 100 kilometers to the north. The Inuit lost access to their traditional hunting areas, their cultural sites, and the graves of their ancestors. Decades later, Danish courts would rule that the relocation was illegal, though the community was never allowed to return. It was an early indication that the military priorities driving Arctic development would not be particularly concerned with the people who already lived there. With Thule operational, the United States had its Arctic stronghold. American bombers could now be based within striking distance of the Soviet Union, ready to launch retaliatory missions on short notice. Radar installations scanned the northern skies for any sign of incoming attack. For a few years this seemed sufficient, but the Sputnik crisis changed the equation again. If the Soviets were ahead in rocket technology, it was only a matter of time before they developed intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching American cities in 30 minutes or less. Bombers suddenly seemed slow and vulnerable. And Thule Air Base, for all its strategic value, was still just a base, a fixed target that Soviet missiles could potentially destroy before American forces had time to respond. This is where the thinking started to get creative, or perhaps desperate, depending on your perspective. Military planners began exploring ideas that sounded like they came from science fiction novels. What if, instead of building bases on the surface where they could be seen and targeted, America built bases underneath the ice? The Greenland ice sheet was enormous, covering almost the entire island to depths that would dwarf any human structure. A facility buried beneath all that ice would be effectively invisible from above, immune to satellite surveillance, and protected from all but the most powerful weapons. It sounded crazy. It was crazy. But in the paranoid atmosphere of the late 1950s, crazy ideas that might work were getting serious attention. The concept that emerged from these discussions would eventually become known as Project Iceworm, though that name would remain classified for decades. The idea was breathtaking in its ambition and its absurdity. The United States would construct a vast network of tunnels beneath the Greenland ice sheet, thousands of kilometers of interconnected passages housing mobile nuclear missile launchers. The missiles would be mounted on railroad cars that would constantly move through the tunnel system, never staying in one place long enough for Soviet intelligence to pinpoint their location. Even if the Soviets somehow discovered the network and launched a preemptive strike, they would never be able to destroy all the missiles because they would never know exactly where the missiles were at any given moment. It was essentially an underground shell game with nuclear weapons, and Pentagon planners were convinced it could work. But there was a small problem. Actually, there were many problems, but the most immediate one was that nobody had ever tried to build anything on this scale beneath an ice sheet before. The engineering challenges were completely unknown. Could you even construct permanent structures in ice? How would the ice behave over time? Would it crush any tunnels carved into it, or would the tunnels remain stable? What about temperature control, ventilation, power generation? The entire concept was built on assumptions that had never been tested. Before committing billions of dollars to Project Iceworm, the military needed proof that the basic concept was feasible. They needed a test case, a demonstration project that could work out the engineering problems while also providing useful cover for the real objective. They needed Camp Century. The plan was elegant in its deception. Camp Century would be presented to the world as a scientific research station, a peaceful facility dedicated to studying the unique environment of the Greenland ice sheet. Scientists would drill ice cores, analyze snow accumulation patterns, and conduct experiments that could not be performed anywhere else on Earth. The Army Corps of Engineers would gain invaluable experience in polar construction techniques, And if anyone asked why the military was so interested in scientific research, well, the Cold War demanded that America stay ahead in all fields of knowledge, did it not? The humanitarian cover story would provide perfect camouflage for the real purpose, testing the feasibility of building and maintaining an underground nuclear missile base beneath hundreds of meters of ice. The location selected for Camp Sentry was roughly 150 miles inland from Thule Air Base, high on the Greenland ice sheet at an elevation of about 6,000 feet. This was not the relatively accessible coastal zone where Thule had been built. This was the deep interior, an endless white desert where temperatures routinely dropped below -40 degrees, and the nearest tree was about 1,000 miles away. The ice beneath the construction site was more than a mile thick, a frozen archive containing hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated snowfall. On the surface there was nothing. No landmarks, no shelter, no life of any kind. Just ice and snow stretching to the horizon in every direction, and above it all the relentless wind. Building here would require solving problems that no one had ever encountered before. Every piece of equipment, every ton of supplies, every worker would have to be transported by aircraft or tractor convoy from Thule across 150 miles of featureless ice. There were no roads, no GPS, no reliable landmarks for navigation. Whiteout conditions could reduce visibility to 0 in minutes, leaving convoys stranded and disoriented. The cold was so intense that metal became brittle and fuel turned to sludge. Workers would have to be rotated frequently to prevent psychological breakdown from isolation and the endless monotony of the white landscape. And at the end of all this effort, whatever they built would be slowly but constantly moving, carried along by the glacial flow of the ice sheet itself toward the distant sea. Despite these challenges, or perhaps because of them, the project moved forward. In 1959, the first construction teams arrived at the site that would become Camp Century. They had no illusions about the difficulty of the task ahead. They also had no real idea whether what they were attempting was even possible. They were about to find out. Now, before we get to the actual construction of Camp Century, there is a fascinating little footnote in American diplomatic history that deserves some attention, because the United States did not just want to build bases on Greenland. At one point, they tried to buy the entire island. Yes, the whole thing. All 836,000 square miles of it, most of which is permanently covered in ice. American foreign policy in the mid-20th century was apparently operating on the same logic as a monopoly player who has just landed on Park Place and is feeling ambitious. The idea of purchasing Greenland was not actually new. Back in 1867, the United States had successfully bought Alaska from Russia, a transaction that was mocked at the time as Seward's folly, but turned out to be one of the greatest real estate deals in history. So when American strategists looked at a map and saw this enormous Arctic island sitting right between them and their Soviet adversaries, the thought process was fairly straightforward. We bought Alaska, that worked out pretty well, maybe we can do the same thing here. The fact that Greenland belonged to Denmark, a functioning European democracy and NATO ally rather than a cash-strapped Russian empire, was apparently considered a minor detail. In 1946, fresh from victory in World War II and flush with confidence, the Truman administration made its move. Secretary of State James Burns approached the Danish government with what American officials apparently considered a generous offer: $100 million in gold for complete sovereignty over Greenland. To put this in perspective, $100 million in 1946 was real money, roughly equivalent to about $1.5 billion today. The Americans were not trying to lowball anyone. They genuinely believed this was a fair price for the world's largest island, and they expected the Danes to see the wisdom of the arrangement. The Danish response was polite but firm. Thanks, but no thanks. Greenland was not for sale. The island had been part of the Danish realm since the 18th century, home to a small but significant indigenous population, and selling it to a foreign power was simply not on the table. Danish public opinion would never accept it, and more importantly, the Danes saw Greenland as part of their national identity, not some disposable colonial asset to be traded for gold. The American diplomats were reportedly surprised by the rejection. Apparently, the concept that some things are not for sale had not occurred to them. But here is where things get interesting. While Denmark refused to sell Greenland outright, the Danish government was not blind to geopolitical realities. The Soviet threat was real. Denmark was a small country with limited military resources, and having American protection in the Arctic was not exactly a bad thing, so a compromise emerged. Denmark would retain sovereignty over Greenland, but the United States would be granted permission to establish military bases on the island under a bilateral defense agreement. The Americans would get their strategic foothold, the Danes would keep their territory, and everyone could pretend this was a partnership of equals rather than a superpower, getting most of what it wanted anyway. Diplomacy at its finest. The crown jewel of this arrangement, as we discussed, was Thule Air Base, but Thule was just the beginning. The real ambition lay further inland, where the ice sheet stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction, and no human had ever attempted to build anything permanent. This is where Camp Sentry enters the picture, and where the engineering challenges went from difficult to seemingly impossible. The site selected for Camp Sentry was about 150 miles from Thule, deep in the interior of the ice sheet at an elevation of roughly 6,000 feet. There was nothing there, and by nothing, we mean absolutely nothing. No rock, no soil, no vegetation, no landmarks of any kind. Just ice, stretching to the horizon in every direction, and above it the endless Arctic sky. The ice beneath the surface was estimated to be over a mile thick, accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years. This was not terrain that invited human habitation. This was terrain that actively discouraged it. The first challenge was simply getting there. From Thule, supply convoys had to traverse 150 miles of ice sheet with no roads, no trails, and frequently no visibility. Navigation relied on compass bearings and dead reckoning, which sounds adventurous until you realize that magnetic compasses behave erratically near the poles, and dead reckoning in a featureless white landscape is basically just educated guessing. Whiteout conditions could descend without warning, reducing visibility to zero and leaving convoys completely disoriented. Vehicles would sometimes drive in circles for hours, burning precious fuel while their crews tried to figure out which direction they were supposed to be heading. Not exactly what you would call optimal logistics. But assuming you could actually reach the construction site, the real problems began. How do you build a permanent structure in ice? Ice is not stable like rock or soil. It moves, it flows, it responds to temperature and pressure in ways that are difficult to predict. A building placed on the surface would gradually sink as its weight compressed the snow beneath it. Heat from the structure would melt the surrounding ice, creating instability, and the entire ice sheet was slowly but constantly moving, flowing like an incredibly viscous river toward the coast. Anything built on or in the ice would eventually be carried along with it, deformed, crushed, or both. The solution the Army Corps of Engineers developed was both ingenious and slightly insane. Instead of building on the surface, they would build beneath it. Not in the ice itself, which would be too unstable, but in the compacted snow layer above the deep ice, where temperatures were constant and the material was more workable. The plan called for cutting a series of parallel trenches into the snow, roofing them with prefabricated arches, and then covering the whole thing with more snow for insulation and camouflage. The result would be an underground city, invisible from above, protected from the brutal surface weather, and maintained at a relatively comfortable temperature by the insulating properties of the surrounding snow. The trenches were cut using modified Swiss snow removal machines, the same type of equipment used to clear mountain passes in the Alps. These massive rotary cutters could chew through compacted snow at an impressive rate, throwing the excavated material to either side as they advanced. The machines had never been designed for this kind of work, of course. They were meant to clear roads, not dig underground cities. But in the grand tradition of military engineering, if the right tool did not exist, you adapted something close enough and hoped for the best. 23 trenches were excavated in total, each one carefully aligned and spaced according to the master plan. The main trench, which would serve as the camp's central corridor, stretched for over 1,100 feet and was wide enough to accommodate two-way vehicle traffic. Smaller trenches branched off from this central spine, housing individual buildings, storage facilities, and utility systems. The total length of trench tunnels would eventually exceed 2 miles, creating an underground network of passages that felt more like a subway system than a military base. Once the trenches were cut, construction crews moved in to install the structural framework. This consisted of prefabricated steel arches, curved sections that could be bolted together to form a semicircular roof over each trench. The arches were designed to support the weight of accumulated snow while still allowing enough headroom for buildings and equipment inside. Installing them was back-breaking work, especially in temperatures that routinely dropped below -40 degrees. Metal becomes incredibly dangerous to handle in extreme cold. Touch it with bare skin and it will stick, potentially tearing away flesh when you pull back. Drop a wrench and it might shatter like glass. Every task that would take minutes in normal conditions could take hours in the Arctic. With the arches in place, the trenches were covered with layers of snow that would eventually compact into a solid roof. Additional snow was piled on top for insulation, and within a relatively short time the entire complex became invisible from above. An aircraft flying over the site would see nothing but an unbroken expanse of white, indistinguishable from the surrounding ice sheet. This was exactly the effect the military wanted. Camp Sentry would be a secret hidden in plain sight, buried beneath the frozen surface of one of the most remote places on Earth. Inside the tunnels, construction crews built the actual facilities that would make Camp Sentry a functioning community. Prefabricated buildings were assembled inside the protective framework of the arches, connected by covered walkways that allowed personnel to move between facilities without ever exposing themselves to the surface conditions. There was a mess hall capable of feeding the entire camp, sleeping quarters, recreation areas, a library, a chapel, a barbershop, a post office, and even a small hospital with surgical facilities. The planners had thought of everything needed to sustain human life in complete isolation from the outside world. The work proceeded around the clock, which in the Arctic summer meant something unusual. North of the Arctic Circle during summer months the sun never sets. It circles the horizon in a continuous loop, providing endless daylight but also playing havoc with human circadian rhythms. Workers reported severe sleep difficulties, persistent headaches, and a creeping disorientation that came from never experiencing darkness. The body's internal clock depends on regular cycles of light and dark, and when those cycles disappear, strange things happen. Some men found themselves lying awake for hours, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. Others would fall asleep at random times, their bodies simply giving up on trying to maintain a normal schedule. To combat these effects, the camp eventually installed blackout curtains and established strict schedules that artificially created day and night cycles, but during the construction phase such luxuries were not available. Workers pushed through 12-hour shifts, caught whatever sleep they could, and kept building. The military had set an aggressive timeline, and meeting it took priority over crew comfort. Besides, there was something strangely motivating about the project itself. These men were building something that had never been attempted before, creating a city in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. The sheer audacity of it seemed to drive them forward. As the tunnels took shape and the interior structures rose within them, Camp Sentry began to feel less like a construction site and more like an actual community. The walls were lined with wooden panels for insulation and aesthetic appeal, giving the underground spaces a surprisingly homey atmosphere. Electric lighting banished the darkness, and heating systems maintained comfortable temperatures even as the surface above might be experiencing temperatures of -60 degrees or worse. Men who had expected to spend their deployment in miserable conditions found themselves in an environment that was, if not exactly luxurious, at least tolerable. The mess hall became a particular point of pride. In contrast to the freeze-dried monotony that typically characterized Arctic field rations, Camp Sentry's kitchen was fully equipped to prepare fresh meals. Supplies brought in from Thule included fresh vegetables, meat, and even the ingredients for baked goods. Holiday meals were celebrated with appropriate fanfare, with turkey and all the traditional accompaniments for Thanksgiving and Christmas. The army understood that in an isolated environment, morale depended heavily on small comforts, and food was chief among them. But all of this construction, all of these carefully planned amenities were meaningless without one crucial element: power. Running an underground city requires enormous amounts of electricity. Lights, heating systems, ventilation fans, water treatment, communications equipment, scientific instruments, kitchen appliances, everything needed constant electrical supply. In most locations, you would simply connect to the power grid or install diesel generators. But Camp Sentry was 150 miles from the nearest significant power source, and hauling enough diesel fuel to run generators year-round would require a constant stream of supply convoys that would stretch logistics to the breaking point. The solution the military proposed was revolutionary, dangerous, and had never been attempted before. Camp Sentry would be powered by a portable nuclear reactor. Not a large commercial power plant, but a compact unit specifically designed for remote military installations, small enough to be transported in pieces and assembled on site. The reactor would provide all the electricity Camp Sentry needed, plus enough waste heat to help maintain comfortable temperatures in the tunnels. It was an elegant solution on paper. In practice, it would prove to be one of the most anxiety-inducing aspects of the entire project. But that, as they say, is a story for the next chapter. So we left off with Camp Sentry taking shape beneath the Greenland ice, a remarkable feat of engineering that solved almost every problem of Arctic survival. Almost. Because there was still the small matter of keeping the lights on, and the solution the Army chose for that particular challenge was about as ambitious as everything else about this project. They decided to install a nuclear reactor, underground. In the ice, in a facility that had never existed before. What could possibly go wrong? The reactor in question was designated the PM-2A, where PM stood for portable medium power, and the 2A indicated it was the second iteration of this particular design. Calling it portable was perhaps a bit generous. The complete system weighed several hundred tons and required multiple shipments to transport all the components. But compared to a conventional nuclear power plant, which might cover several acres and require years of on-site construction, the PM-2A was practically pocket-sized. It was specifically designed for remote military installations where conventional power sources were impractical, and Camp Sentry was about as remote as installations got. The components arrived at Thule aboard the cargo vessel Marine Fiddler in the summer of 1960, carefully packed in containers that gave no indication of their radioactive contents. From Thule, everything had to be transported overland to Camp Sentry, a journey that required specially designed tracked vehicles capable of hauling heavy loads across the ice sheet. The reactor vessel itself, the heart of the system containing the uranium fuel, travelled in its own dedicated convoy with armed guards and strict protocols for handling. Nobody wanted to be responsible for losing a nuclear reactor in a crevasse somewhere between Thule and the construction site. Now here is where things get a little unsettling. The PM-2A had been designed and manufactured, but it had never actually been tested as a complete assembled unit. The individual components had been checked and verified, the engineering calculations had been performed, and everyone was reasonably confident that the system would work as intended. But the first time all those pieces would come together and the reactor would actually go critical, generating sustained nuclear fission and producing power, would be right there in Camp Sentry, buried under the ice, miles from anywhere. The phrase confidence in engineering was doing a lot of heavy lifting in this scenario. The installation process took several months. A dedicated trench had been excavated to house the reactor facility, separate from the main camp tunnels but connected to them for power distribution. Workers assembled the reactor vessel, installed the control systems, connected the steam turbines and generators, and ran through countless checklists to verify that everything was in place. The men performing this work were trained specialists, but even they must have felt some unease about what they were doing. Nuclear technology in 1960 was still relatively new, and the long-term effects of radiation exposure were not as well understood as they would become in later decades. Everyone knew that radiation was dangerous, but exactly how dangerous, and under what circumstances, remained somewhat fuzzy. The day the reactor went critical for the first time was one of the most tense in Camp Sentry's short history. Engineers monitored instruments, checked readings, and held their breath as the control rods were slowly withdrawn and the nuclear chain reaction began. The reactor worked. Power flowed. The generators hummed to life, and Camp Sentry suddenly had all the electricity it could possibly need, generated by the splitting of uranium atoms right there beneath the Arctic ice. It was a triumph of engineering, a demonstration that nuclear power could be deployed in even the most extreme environments. And then someone checked the radiation monitors. The readings were not good. Actually, the readings were alarming. Radiation levels in the reactor trench and adjacent tunnels were significantly higher than expected, high enough to pose potential health risks to anyone spending extended time in those areas. The shielding that had been built into the reactor design was apparently not sufficient for the actual operating conditions. Something had to be done, and it had to be done quickly, because the alternative was either shutting down the reactor and losing all power, or accepting that personnel would be accumulating dangerous radiation doses every day they remained at camp. Sentry. The solution was about as elegant as you might expect from a military operation facing an unexpected crisis. They threw lead at the problem. Emergency shipments of lead plates were rushed to the site, transported across the ice sheet with the same urgency that might accompany medical supplies during an epidemic. Workers installed these additional shielding barriers around the reactor facility, creating layers of dense metal to absorb the radiation that was leaking into the surrounding tunnels. It was not a permanent fix, and it certainly was not how the reactor was supposed to operate, but it reduced the radiation levels to something approaching acceptable limits. Acceptable, of course, is a relative term. The men stationed at Camp Sentry still lived and worked in close proximity to an operating nuclear reactor, separated from it by walls of snow and hastily installed lead plates. The sleeping quarters were not far from the reactor trench, and some personnel reported lying awake at night thinking about the invisible particles that might be passing through their bodies as they tried to rest. Radiation is uniquely terrifying precisely because you cannot see it, smell it, or feel it. You simply have to trust that the shielding is adequate and the measurements are accurate. In an era when nuclear accidents had already demonstrated the horrific consequences of radiation exposure, that trust did not come easily. Despite these concerns, the reactor operated successfully for the next 3 years, providing reliable power to Camp Sentry through some of the harshest conditions on Earth. The waste heat from the system helped warm the underground facilities, reducing the demand on other heating systems and making life in the tunnels considerably more comfortable. In a strange way, the nuclear reactor became the beating heart of Camp Sentry, the source of warmth and light that made human habitation possible in a place where humans had no business being. The men who lived there developed a complicated relationship with the machine, simultaneously grateful for what it provided and anxious about what it represented. But enough about glowing uranium and radiation anxiety. Let us talk about something equally unlikely. A teenager with a camera and a diary, who somehow ended up as one of the most important witnesses to this entire secret operation. His name was Erik Holstebro, and in 1960 he was an 18-year-old Danish student with a keen interest in photography and adventure. How a teenage civilian ended up at a classified American military installation buried under the Greenland ice sheet is one of those stories that only makes sense in the context of Cold War public relations. The United States Army, despite the secret nature of their actual objectives, wanted positive publicity for Camp Sentry. The official cover story was that this was a scientific research station, an international effort to study the Arctic environment, and what better way to reinforce that image than by inviting friendly visitors to document the peaceful, scientific work being done. Denmark, as the sovereign power over Greenland, was an obvious choice for such goodwill gestures, and young Erik, with his enthusiasm for photography and his wholesome student credentials, was apparently deemed an ideal candidate to visit the facility and share his experiences with the Danish public. The army flew him to Thule, transported him across the ice sheet to Camp Sentry, and gave him remarkable access to the underground complex. He photographed everything he was allowed to photograph, kept detailed notes in a personal diary, and inadvertently created one of the most valuable first-hand accounts of daily life in the Ice City. Erik's diary entries paint a picture of Camp Sentry that official army documentation often misses. He describes the strange sensation of living underground, where the only indication of time passing was the clock on the wall rather than any change in the light filtering down from above. He writes about the food in the mess hall, which was surprisingly good by military standards, with holiday meals featuring turkey, stuffing, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie prepared by cooks who understood that morale in an isolated environment depended heavily on the quality of meals. Christmas at Camp Sentry was apparently quite the occasion, with decorations in the tunnels and a genuine effort to create festive atmosphere despite the bizarre circumstances. He also documented the more mundane aspects of life in the ice. The constant battle against snow accumulation, as the weight of new snowfall pressed down on the tunnel roofs, and maintenance crews worked continuously to reinforce structures and clear passages. The odd hobbies men developed to pass the time during the long Arctic winter, from reading clubs to amateur radio operation to elaborate practical jokes played on fellow residents. Erik himself spent his downtime reading, and his diary mentions working through a copy of Dr. Zhivago, Boris Pasternak's epic novel of the Russian Revolution. There is something wonderfully ironic about a young Dane reading a Soviet-banned novel about Russian suffering while sitting in an American military base designed to help defend against Soviet aggression, all of it taking place beneath an Arctic glacier. The Cold War produced some strange juxtapositions, but perhaps the most significant aspect of Erik's visit was what he photographed without fully understanding its importance. During his time at Camp Sentry, construction was underway on what was described to him as experimental railroad tracks in a side tunnel. He was told this was part of ongoing research into transportation methods under ice sheet conditions, and he dutifully photographed the rails being laid and the small rail cars being tested. What he did not know, and would not learn until decades later when classified documents were finally released, was that he had just documented evidence of Project Iceworm, the secret plan to build thousands of kilometers of underground rail lines for mobile nuclear missile launchers. Those 3 photographs that Eric took of the test railroad became some of the only visual evidence that Project Iceworm ever progressed beyond the planning stage. When the project was finally declassified in the 1990s, researchers searching for documentation found remarkably little physical evidence of the missile tunnel tests. Most of it had been destroyed, lost, or buried under decades of accumulated snow and ice. But Eric's photographs survived, tucked away in his personal collection, proof that the United States had actually begun testing the infrastructure for an underground nuclear missile network beneath the Greenland ice sheet. A teenager with a camera had inadvertently preserved one of the Cold War's most closely guarded secrets. Eric returned to Denmark after his visit, shared his photographs and stories with local media, and generally portrayed Camp Sentry as the scientific research station it was supposed to be. He had no reason to suspect anything more sinister was going on. The army had been careful about what they showed him, and the cover story was convincing enough that even someone who had actually been inside the facility came away believing the official narrative. It was only years later, when the truth about Project Iceworm emerged, that Eric realized what he had actually witnessed during those few weeks in the ice. His diary and photographs have since become valuable historical documents, offering a human perspective on a facility that might otherwise be remembered only through dry military reports and engineering specifications. Through Eric's eyes, we see Camp Sentry not as a strategic asset or a classified project, but as a place where real people lived and worked, celebrated holidays, read novels, complained about the food, and tried to maintain some sense of normalcy in one of the most abnormal environments imaginable. The Ice City was never just about missiles and reactors. It was also about the hundreds of men who called it home, however temporarily, and tried to make the best of a very strange situation. As for the reactor, it continued operating until 1963, when it was finally shut down and removed from the site. The Army had learned what it needed to learn about portable nuclear power in Arctic conditions, and the strategic rationale for Camp Sentry itself was beginning to shift. The reactor vessel and its radioactive components were carefully extracted and transported back to the United States for disposal, leaving behind only the non-nuclear portions of the power plant and the lead shielding that had been installed during that first anxious year of operation. In theory, the site was cleaned up. In practice, as we'll see later, the definition of cleaned up proved to be rather flexible when it came to what got left behind in the ice. Alright, so we have established that Camp Sentry was an impressive achievement, an underground city in the Arctic powered by a nuclear reactor, capable of sustaining human life in one of the most hostile environments on the planet. Pretty remarkable stuff. But here is the thing. Camp Sentry was never really about scientific research, comfortable living quarters, or even demonstrating American engineering prowess. It was a test bed, a proof of concept, a very expensive dress rehearsal for something much, much bigger. Welcome to Project Iceworm, quite possibly the most ambitious and insane military construction project ever seriously considered by the United States government. The basic concept behind Project Iceworm sounds like something a Bond villain would dismiss as impractical. The plan called for the construction of a vast network of tunnels beneath the Greenland ice sheet, stretching for thousands of kilometers in a web of interconnected passages. Within this underground labyrinth, the United States would deploy hundreds of nuclear missiles mounted on mobile railroad cars. The missiles would constantly move through the tunnel system, never remaining in one location long enough for Soviet intelligence to pinpoint their position. Even if the Soviets somehow detected the network, they would face an impossible targeting problem. How do you destroy missiles when you have no idea where they are at any given moment? The answer, Pentagon planners believed, was that you simply could not. Let us talk numbers for a moment because the scale of Project Iceworm is genuinely staggering. The proposed tunnel network would have covered approximately 52,000 square miles of the Greenland ice sheet, an area roughly the size of New York State. Within this zone, engineers planned to construct around 2,500 miles of tunnels, housing 600 nuclear missiles spread across multiple mobile launch platforms. The tunnels would be connected by a rail system, allowing the missiles to be shuffled between positions continuously, making the entire arsenal essentially untraceable. Picture a game of 3-card Monte, except instead of cards you have thermonuclear warheads, and instead of a street corner you have an area the size of a medium-sized country buried under a glacier. The Soviets would never know which shell the pea was under, so to speak. The strategic logic behind this madness was actually somewhat sound, at least by Cold War standards. The fundamental problem of nuclear deterrence was survivability. For the threat of retaliation to be credible, you had to convince your enemy that they could not destroy your nuclear arsenal in a first strike. If the Soviets believed they could knock out all American nuclear forces before the United States could respond, the deterrent would fail, and the risk of war would actually increase. The challenge was that traditional nuclear delivery systems, bombers and fixed missile silos, were vulnerable to exactly this kind of preemptive attack. Bombers could be destroyed on the ground, silos could be targeted with precision strikes, and neither could be easily hidden from the ever-improving capabilities of Soviet reconnaissance satellites. Mobile missiles offered a potential solution. A missile that was constantly moving could not be targeted because its location was never fixed. The Soviets might know roughly where your missiles were deployed, but they could never be certain exactly where any individual missile was at the moment they needed to destroy it. This uncertainty was the key to survivability. Even a massive first strike would inevitably miss some missiles, and those surviving weapons would be more than sufficient to deliver catastrophic retaliation. The problem was finding a way to keep missiles moving continuously, without making them vulnerable to detection and attack while in transit. Underground railroads beneath the ice sheet seemed to solve this problem elegantly. The missiles would be completely invisible from above, shielded by hundreds of feet of ice that no satellite camera could penetrate. The constant movement would make targeting impossible, even if the tunnel locations were somehow discovered. The Arctic environment, while challenging for construction, would actually help preserve the tunnels once they were built, with the cold temperatures preventing the kind of structural degradation that would occur in warmer climates. And Greenland's strategic location, close to Soviet territory but firmly under American control through the defense agreement with Denmark, made it an ideal site for this kind of deployment. Of course, there were a few minor issues with the plan. Like, for instance, the fact that nobody had ever built anything remotely like this before. The engineering challenges were not just significant, they were unprecedented. Digging 2,500 miles of tunnels through ice and compacted snow would require construction techniques that did not yet exist. Maintaining those tunnels over time, preventing them from being crushed by the moving ice sheet or collapsing under accumulated snow, would be a constant battle against nature. Keeping 600 nuclear missiles operational in sub-zero temperatures, moving them continuously on underground railroads, powering the entire operation year-round in complete isolation from the outside world. Each of these problems was enormous on its own, and Project Iceworm required solving all of them simultaneously. This is where Camp Sentry entered the picture. Before committing the billions of dollars that Project Iceworm would require, the military needed answers to some fundamental questions. Could you actually build stable structures beneath the ice sheet? How would those structures behave over time? What kind of power systems would work in such an environment? How would you supply and maintain a large-scale operation hundreds of miles from the nearest port? Camp Sentry was designed to answer these questions. It was a laboratory for Arctic construction, a test site for the technologies and techniques that would make Project Iceworm possible. The scientific research was real, but it was always secondary to the military objectives hiding beneath the surface. The test railroad that Eric Holstebro photographed during his visit was a small-scale prototype of the transportation system that would eventually shuttle nuclear missiles through the ice. Engineers laid tracks in a dedicated tunnel and experimented with different railcar designs, propulsion systems, and track configurations. They tested how the rails would behave as the surrounding ice shifted and settled, how to maintain traction on frozen surfaces, and how to keep the system operational in temperatures that would make conventional equipment brittle and unreliable. These experiments were crucial for determining whether the mobile missile concept was actually feasible, and the results were promising enough to encourage further development. But the experiments also revealed problems, serious problems. The ice beneath Camp Sentry was not behaving the way engineers had hoped. Remember, a glacier is not a static object. It flows, slowly but constantly, driven by its own enormous weight pressing down on the underlying rock. The ice sheet beneath Camp Century was moving at a rate of about 4 feet per year, which does not sound like much until you realise that this meant any structures built in the ice would gradually be deformed, twisted, and eventually crushed by the relentless pressure. The tunnels at Camp Century were already showing signs of this deformation within just a few years of construction, requiring constant maintenance to keep them usable. There was also the heat problem. Human beings generate heat, and so does their equipment. This heat transferred into the surrounding ice, causing localized melting that weakened the tunnel walls and created instability. The nuclear reactor was particularly problematic in this regard, producing significant waste heat that had to be carefully managed to prevent it from literally melting the facility around it. In a small installation like Camp Century, these issues were manageable with constant attention and maintenance. In a tunnel network stretching for thousands of miles, they would be catastrophic. The ice would slowly but inevitably reclaim any structures built within it, and keeping pace with that process across such a vast area would be practically impossible. The classified assessments of Project Iceworm acknowledged these challenges, but initially remained optimistic. Engineers proposed various solutions: improved insulation, active cooling systems, tunnel designs that could accommodate ice movement without structural failure. Pentagon planners crunched numbers and produced cost estimates that ran into the tens of billions of dollars, staggering sums even by Cold War standards, but potentially worthwhile if the system actually worked as intended. For a few years in the early 1960s, Project Iceworm remained a serious contender for America's nuclear future. What ultimately killed the project was not the engineering challenges, though those were formidable. It was a shift in strategic thinking that made the entire concept obsolete before it could be built. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction: submarines. The United States Navy had been developing nuclear-powered submarines capable of launching ballistic missiles while submerged, and by the early 1960s this technology was maturing rapidly. The Polaris missile system, deployed aboard a new class of submarines, offered everything that Project Iceworm promised and more. The submarines were mobile, hidden beneath the ocean where Soviet satellites could not track them. They could patrol for months at a time, surfacing only occasionally and never in predictable locations. And unlike a tunnel network that required years of construction and enormous fixed infrastructure, submarines could be built in existing shipyards and deployed wherever they were needed. The advantages of submarine-launched missiles were overwhelming. A single submarine carrying 16 Polaris missiles represented a devastating nuclear capability that could strike Soviet targets from virtually anywhere in the world's oceans. A fleet of such submarines would be essentially invulnerable to first strike, since the Soviets would never know where all of them were at any given time. The cost per missile deployed was a fraction of what Project Iceworm would require, and the system could be operational years sooner. By 1963, the strategic calculus had shifted decisively in favour of submarine-based deterrence, and Project Iceworm quietly faded from the Pentagon's priority list. The official termination of the project came without public announcement, which was fitting for a program that had never been publicly acknowledged in the first place. The classified documents were filed away, the research data was archived, and the few photographs documenting the test railroad in Camp Century's tunnels became historical curiosities rather than evidence of an ongoing program. The Danish government, which had never been informed about the true purpose of American activities on their territory, remained blissfully unaware that the United States had been planning to turn Greenland into a nuclear missile base without bothering to ask permission. This last point deserves some emphasis, because it raises questions about Cold War ethics that remain uncomfortable to this day. Project Iceworm would have deployed hundreds of nuclear weapons on Danish soil, making Greenland a primary target for Soviet attack in any future conflict. The Danish people, whose territory this was, had no say in this decision. Their government had agreed to allow American bases for defensive purposes, radar installations, and airfields that would protect against Soviet bombers. Nobody had mentioned anything about turning the country into a nuclear launch platform. When the details of Project Iceworm were finally declassified in 1997, the revelation caused considerable diplomatic embarrassment and raised pointed questions about what else the United States might have done without informing its allies. But in the early 1960s, none of this was public knowledge. As far as the world knew, Camp Century was exactly what it claimed to be: a scientific research station dedicated to studying the unique environment of the Greenland ice sheet. The Army continued to operate the facility, conducting legitimate research alongside its secret military experiments. Scientists drilled ice cores that would provide invaluable data about Earth's climate history. Engineers refined their understanding of polar construction techniques, and the cover story held even as the strategic rationale for the whole operation quietly dissolved. What remained was an underground city that no longer had a clear purpose, a nuclear reactor that was expensive to maintain and increasingly unnecessary, and a growing collection of equipment, supplies, and waste that would eventually become someone else's problem. The most ambitious military construction project of the Cold War had been abandoned before it ever really began, leaving behind only a few photographs, some classified documents, and a facility buried in ice that was slowly being reclaimed by the glacier that surrounded it. The question of what to do about Camp Sentry itself was about to become considerably more complicated. While the secret military objectives of Camp Sentry remained hidden from public view, the United States Army had absolutely no intention of keeping the facility itself a secret. Quite the opposite, actually. Camp Sentry was destined to become one of the most heavily documented and enthusiastically publicized military projects of the entire Cold War. Because if you are going to build an underground city in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, you might as well get some good PR out of it. And boy, did the Army deliver on that front. From the very beginning of construction, military camera crews documented every phase of the project with the kind of attention to detail usually reserved for Hollywood productions. They filmed the trenches being cut into the ice, the arches being installed, the buildings rising within the tunnels. They captured workers battling the elements, engineers solving impossible problems, and soldiers going about their daily routines in this extraordinary environment. The footage was professionally edited, scored with stirring music, and released to television networks across America as a testament to what the nation could achieve when it put its mind to something. Forget Sputnik, the message seemed to say. Look what we can do. The resulting documentary, released in 1961 under the title Sentry City Under the Ice, was a masterpiece of Cold War image-making. It presented Camp Sentry as the ultimate triumph of American ingenuity and determination, a shining example of what free people could accomplish through hard work and technological prowess. The film lingered lovingly on all the comforts of home that had been recreated beneath the glacier: private sleeping quarters with real beds, a mess hall serving hot meals, recreational facilities where soldiers could unwind after a hard day's work. There was a barbershop, a library stocked with books and magazines, even a chapel where men could attend religious services on Sundays. The message was clear: America could project its way of life anywhere, even to the frozen ends of the earth. The hot showers received particular emphasis, and you can understand why. Nothing says, "We have conquered this environment," quite like the ability to take a comfortable shower when the temperature outside is minus 50 degrees. The Army made sure viewers understood that the men at Camp Sentry were not suffering in some primitive outpost, shivering in sleeping bags and eating freeze-dried rations. They were living in relative comfort, enjoying amenities that would have seemed luxurious even by stateside standards. The psychological warfare aspect was unmistakable. If the Soviets were watching, and they certainly were, they were meant to understand that American soldiers could operate effectively anywhere, under any conditions, without sacrificing the creature comforts that defined the American way of life. The massive cold storage facility was another highlight of the propaganda tour. Camp Sentry maintained a freezer large enough to store months' worth of food supplies, which sounds less impressive until you remember that the entire facility was already frozen solid. The engineering challenge was actually keeping things from freezing too hard, maintaining temperatures that would preserve food without turning it into inedible ice blocks. But the visual of all those supplies neatly organized and ready to sustain the garrison through the long Arctic winter communicated abundance and preparedness. America would not be caught short. America planned ahead. America had refrigerators inside its refrigerator because why not? The documentary carefully avoided any mention of the nuclear reactor, presenting Camp Sentry's power supply as coming from conventional diesel generators. This was technically true in a sense, since diesel generators did provide backup power, but the primary electrical supply came from that portable nuclear plant humming away in its shielded tunnel. The Army was not about to tell the American public, let alone the Soviets, that they had installed an experimental nuclear reactor under the ice sheet. That would raise too many questions, generate too much controversy, and potentially reveal the true military nature of the facility. Better to let everyone think this was just a really impressive diesel operation. Similarly absent from the documentary was any hint of Project Iceworm or the missile tunnel experiments being conducted in the facility's classified sections. As far as the film was concerned, Camp Sentry existed purely for scientific research and to demonstrate Arctic survival techniques. The ice core drilling program received extensive coverage, presented as a noble scientific endeavour to unlock the secrets of Earth's climate history, which it genuinely was, incidentally. The scientists working on ice core analysis at Camp Sentry produced groundbreaking research that continues to inform our understanding of past climate conditions. The irony is that this legitimate scientific work was always intended as cover for the illegitimate military objectives, yet it ended up being one of the most valuable legacies of the entire project. The timing of the Camp Sentry publicity campaign was no accident. The early 1960s represented a period of intense psychological competition between the superpowers, with both sides eager to demonstrate technological superiority and ideological virtue. The space race dominated headlines, but it was not the only arena where this competition played out. Every achievement, every breakthrough, every impressive feat of engineering became ammunition in the propaganda war. And Camp Sentry, with its dramatic visuals and compelling narrative of human triumph over nature, was perfectly designed to capture public imagination and restore some of the prestige that Sputnik had stolen. The Soviet response to American technological achievements during this period was a masterclass in strategic bluffing. Premier Nikita Khrushchev, that colourful and unpredictable leader who had famously banged his shoe on a desk at the United Nations, understood that perception often mattered more than reality in the Cold War competition. When it came to nuclear missiles, the Soviet Union was actually far behind the United States in deployed weapons. The Americans had hundreds of nuclear warheads ready for delivery by various means. The Soviets, despite all their bluster, had perhaps 5 intercontinental ballistic missiles that could actually reach American targets in the early 1960s. 5. That is not a typo. But Khrushchev was not about to let the Americans know that. In speeches and interviews, he boasted that Soviet factories were producing missiles like sausages, churning out weapons at an industrial pace that would soon overwhelm any American defensive preparations. The imagery was deliberately chosen to suggest mass production, assembly lines pumping out CBMs the way a butcher's shop might produce bratwurst. Western intelligence analysts scrambled to assess whether these claims were true, and for several years the missile gap became a major political issue in the United States, with critics accusing the Eisenhower administration of allowing the Soviets to gain a dangerous advantage. The reality, as American spy planes and eventually satellites would reveal, was rather different. Soviet missile production was actually quite limited, hampered by technical difficulties and resource constraints. The sausage factory was producing maybe a sausage or 2 per year, metaphorically speaking. But Khrushchev's bluff worked brilliantly for a time, forcing the United States to invest enormous resources in missile defense and offensive capabilities based on an inflated estimate of Soviet strength. It was theatre, but theatre with very real consequences for military spending and strategic planning on both sides. This context helps explain why Camp Sentry mattered so much to American image makers. Every visible demonstration of American capability helped counter the impression that the Soviets were pulling ahead. If the USSR could launch satellites and dogs into orbit, well, the United States could build cities under glaciers. If Khrushchev claimed to be mass-producing missiles, America would show that its technology could thrive in environments where Soviet equipment would freeze solid. The competition was not just about weapons and spacecraft. It was about projecting an image of competence, modernity, and inevitable victory. The propaganda value of Camp Sentry extended beyond American audiences. The Army made sure that footage and photographs reached media outlets around the world, particularly in countries where Cold War allegiances were still being decided. Developing nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were being actively courted by both superpowers, each promising that their system offered the better path to modernization and prosperity. Camp Sentry served as a compelling advertisement for the American approach. Look what we can achieve, look how we take care of our people, look how our technology conquers the impossible. Align with us, and you too can share in this progress. The documentary was translated into multiple languages and distributed through American embassies and information services worldwide. It played in theatres, aired on television networks, and was shown at trade fairs and cultural exhibitions. For millions of people who would never come anywhere near the Arctic, Camp Century became a symbol of American power and ingenuity. The underground city in Greenland, with its hot showers and well-stocked freezers, represented everything that the Cold War West wanted the world to believe about itself. Of course, propaganda works best when it contains a kernel of truth, and Camp Century was genuinely impressive. The men who built and operated the facility accomplished something remarkable under extraordinarily difficult conditions. The scientific research conducted there produced real advances in our understanding of glaciology and climate science. The engineering innovations developed for Arctic construction would find applications in other extreme environments for decades to come. The Army did not have to fabricate Camp Century's achievements, they just had to frame them carefully and omit the inconvenient parts. What the propaganda did not show was the constant struggle to keep the facility functional as the ice slowly crushed its tunnels. It did not show the anxiety of living next to a nuclear reactor that had leaked radiation during its initial operation. It did not show the classified meetings where Pentagon officials discussed using this research station as a base for hundreds of nuclear missiles without bothering to inform America's Danish allies. The carefully curated image of Camp Century was true as far as it went, but it was not the whole truth, and in the Cold War the whole truth was always the first casualty. The Soviets naturally conducted their own propaganda operations, though with a different emphasis. Soviet media portrayed American military activities in the Arctic as aggressive and threatening, evidence of imperialist designs on peaceful northern regions. They did not know the details of Project Iceworm, but they suspected that American bases in Greenland served purposes beyond what was publicly acknowledged. In some ways, their paranoid assumptions were more accurate than the official American cover stories. The Cold War had a way of making everyone's darkest suspicions seem reasonable. Meanwhile, the real Camp Century continued operating, its public image increasingly divergent from its actual condition. By the mid-1960s, the facility was showing serious signs of wear. The tunnels were deforming under ice pressure, requiring constant reinforcement that consumed resources and manpower. The nuclear reactor, having served its purpose as a proof of concept, was scheduled for removal. And with Project Iceworm effectively dead, the strategic rationale for maintaining an expensive underground facility in the middle of nowhere was becoming difficult to justify. The city that had starred in so many propaganda films was approaching the end of its useful life, though the cameras had long since stopped rolling by then. The war of images would continue, of course, finding new battlegrounds and new symbols as the Cold War evolved. But Camp Century's moment in the spotlight was fading. What remained was a facility that had served its purpose, both military and propagandistic, and was now becoming more trouble than it was worth to maintain. The question of what to do with it, and more importantly what to do with everything that had been left inside it, was about to become considerably more pressing. The glamorous underground city of the propaganda films was about to become something much less photogenic, an abandoned hulk slowly being swallowed by the ice, taking its secrets and its waste along with it. October 1962. The world held its breath as two nuclear superpowers squared off in the most dangerous confrontation humanity had ever witnessed. Soviet ships steamed toward Cuba carrying nuclear missiles. American warships formed a blockade across their path. President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a high-stakes game of chicken with the fate of civilization hanging in the balance. For 13 days, the planet teetered on the edge of thermonuclear war. And while all of this was happening, somewhere deep in the Pentagon, officials were reviewing the final assessment reports on Project Iceworm. The timing could not have been more ironic. The Cuban Missile Crisis represented exactly the kind of scenario that Project Iceworm was supposed to address. The Soviets were attempting to place nuclear weapons within striking distance of American cities, threatening to shift the strategic balance in their favor. If those missiles became operational, they could reach targets across the eastern United States within minutes, far too quickly for any meaningful defense or evacuation. The American response demonstrated just how seriously Washington took this threat. Kennedy assembled his closest advisors in secret sessions that lasted through the nights. Military forces went to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached during the Cold War. B-52 bombers loaded with nuclear weapons circled continuously in the air, ready to strike Soviet targets at a moment's notice. In this atmosphere of existential crisis, the idea of building thousands of miles of tunnels under Greenland ice to house mobile nuclear missiles might have seemed more relevant than ever. After all, the whole point of Project Iceworm was to create a survivable nuclear force that could not be destroyed in a Soviet first strike. If the Cuban crisis had escalated to actual conflict, having that underground arsenal would have been invaluable. The project's advocates could point to current events and say, "This is exactly why we need this capability." But the Cuban Missile Crisis also revealed something else, something that would ultimately doom Project Iceworm and render Camp Century strategically obsolete. During those 13 days, the most effective American nuclear deterrent was not based on land at all. It was lurking silently beneath the waves of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. The United States Navy's fleet of nuclear-powered submarines, armed with Polaris ballistic missiles, represented the most survivable nuclear force in existence. The Soviets had no idea where these submarines were at any given moment. They could not track them, could not target them, could not hope to destroy them in a preemptive attack. Even if the USSR somehow managed to eliminate every American bomber and every land-based missile silo, those submarines would still be out there, ready to deliver devastating retaliation. The submarine force did everything Project Iceworm promised to do, but better, cheaper, and without the massive infrastructure investment that building a tunnel network under Greenland would require. A single submarine carrying 16 Polaris missiles represented more nuclear firepower than the entire arsenal of some nuclear powers. A fleet of such submarines, dispersed across the world's oceans, was essentially invulnerable. And unlike the glacial tunnels of Project Iceworm, which would take years to construct and would be limited to a single geographic location, submarines could be built in existing shipyards and deployed wherever strategic needs demanded. The Pentagon's final assessment of Project Iceworm acknowledged that the technical concept was sound. Camp Century had proven that you could build and maintain structures under the ice sheet, at least for a while. The test railroad demonstrated that mobile platforms could operate in underground tunnels. The nuclear reactor showed that power generation in such an environment was feasible. All the fundamental engineering questions had been answered positively. But the strategic calculation had shifted beneath the project's feet. Why spend tens of billions of dollars building something in Greenland when submarines could accomplish the same mission more effectively? The answer was obvious, and Project Iceworm quietly disappeared from the Pentagon's priority list. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended with the Soviets agreeing to withdraw their missiles from Cuba in exchange for an American promise not to invade the island and a secret agreement to remove American missiles from Turkey. The world stepped back from the brink, diplomacy prevailed over destruction, and humanity got to continue existing for at least a while longer. Kennedy and Khrushchev both emerged with their reputations enhanced, having demonstrated the wisdom to avoid catastrophe when lesser leaders might have stumbled into apocalypse. It was, by any reasonable measure, the closest the Cold War ever came to turning hot. For Camp Century, the crisis marked a turning point in a different sense. With Project Iceworm effectively dead and the strategic rationale for the facility evaporating, the question became what to do with this expensive installation in the middle of nowhere. The scientific research programs continued, producing valuable data about ice sheet dynamics and climate history. But science alone could not justify the enormous cost of maintaining an underground city 150 miles from the nearest support base. The Army began scaling back operations, reducing personnel, and contemplating the facility's future. That future, it was becoming clear, would not last very long. The problem was the ice itself. We have mentioned before that the Greenland ice sheet is not a static object but a dynamic system, flowing slowly but inexorably toward the ocean under its own immense weight. This movement, measured in feet per year rather than miles, had always been a factor in Camp Century's design. But the reality of living with that movement proved more challenging than engineers had anticipated. The tunnels were not just sitting still in the ice. They were being carried along with it, stretched and compressed by forces that human construction was never meant to withstand. The deformation started subtly. Doorways that had been perfectly rectangular began to show slight distortions, their frames pushed out of alignment by the shifting ice. Walls developed cracks that had not been there before. The metal arches supporting the tunnel roofs groaned under stresses they were never designed to handle. Maintenance crews worked constantly to shore up weakening sections, reinforce stressed structures, and keep the passages navigable. But it was a losing battle. The ice was patient, relentless, and infinitely more powerful than anything humans could build to resist it. Heat made everything worse. Human bodies generate heat. Cooking generates heat. Lighting, machinery, and especially the nuclear reactor all produce thermal energy that had to go somewhere. In most environments, this heat simply dissipates into the surrounding air and is carried away by ventilation. In an ice tunnel, it transfers directly into the frozen walls, causing localized melting that weakens the structural integrity of the entire system. The Army installed elaborate ventilation systems to carry heat away from critical areas, but the fundamental problem remained. Humans need warmth to survive, and warmth is precisely what ice cannot tolerate. By 1964, the deterioration was becoming impossible to ignore. Tunnels that had been spacious and well-maintained now showed visible compression, their ceilings noticeably lower than when they were first constructed. Some passages had narrowed so much that vehicles could barely fit through. The constant maintenance required to keep the facility operational was consuming resources at an unsustainable rate. Engineers calculated that within a few years, the main tunnels would become impassable, regardless of how much effort was put into reinforcing them. Camp Century was being slowly crushed by the very environment it had been built to exploit. The decision to abandon the facility came in stages rather than all at once. First, non-essential operations were terminated and personnel were transferred back to Thule. Then the scientific programs were wound down, with the most valuable equipment and data being evacuated. The nuclear reactor, which had been shut down in 1963, was carefully disassembled and removed from the site, its radioactive components shipped back to the United States for proper disposal. This last step was crucial. Whatever else happened to Camp Century, the Army was determined not to leave an operating nuclear reactor buried under the ice, where it could cause unpredictable problems for generations to come. But here is where things get ethically complicated, because while the Army took care to remove the nuclear reactor, they were considerably less thorough about everything else. When the last personnel departed Camp Century in 1967, they left behind an astonishing amount of material. Estimates suggest that the abandoned facility contained around 10,000 tons of infrastructure, equipment, and waste. Diesel fuel in underground storage tanks, lubricants and coolants containing PCBs, those toxic industrial chemicals that would later be banned worldwide for their environmental and health effects, sewage that had accumulated over years of occupation, radioactive waste from the reactor's operation, not the reactor itself, but the contaminated materials that had been in contact with it. All of this was simply left in place, buried under the ice. The reasoning, such as it was, went something like this. The Greenland ice sheet had been accumulating snow for hundreds of thousands of years. Camp Century was now dozens of feet below the current surface, and that depth would only increase as new snow continued to fall and compact. Within a few decades, the facility would be hundreds of feet down. Within a few centuries, it would be buried so deep that no one would ever be able to reach it, even if they wanted to. The ice was effectively a permanent tomb, sealing away the waste forever. Problem solved, right? This assumption reflected the scientific understanding of the 1960s, which viewed the Greenland ice sheet as essentially eternal and unchanging on any human timescale. Climate change was not yet recognized as the existential threat it would become. The idea that global temperatures might rise significantly, that ice sheets might begin melting at accelerating rates, that all that buried waste might someday be exposed again, simply did not factor into the calculations. The Army was not being malicious. They were operating on the best available knowledge of their time. Unfortunately, that knowledge would prove to be catastrophically incomplete. The official closure of Camp Century was handled with minimal fanfare. There were no ceremonies, no final photographs, no documentary crews recording the end of an era. The personnel simply packed what they could carry, climbed aboard their aircraft and tracked vehicles, and headed back to Thule. Behind them, the tunnels continued their slow collapse, the ice pressing in from all sides with the patience of geological time. Within a few years, the once spacious passages would be compressed beyond recognition. Within a few decades, the entire facility would be crushed flat, its structures compacted into unrecognizable debris distributed through the ice column. Camp Century, the city under the glacier, was being erased by the same forces that had made it possible in the first place. The irony was not lost on those who had worked there. Humans had built something remarkable in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, had lived and worked in relative comfort beneath hundreds of feet of ice, had conducted groundbreaking research and tested revolutionary technologies. And in the end, nature won anyway. The glacier, indifferent to human ambition, simply absorbed Camp Century the way it absorbed everything else, slowly grinding it down and carrying it away toward the distant ocean. The underground city that was supposed to help America win the Cold War became just another layer in the ice, a thin stratum of crushed metal and frozen waste sandwiched between millennia of accumulated snowfall. But the story does not end there. Because while the Army assumed that Camp Century's waste would remain buried forever, the Earth had other plans. Climate change, that phenomenon which Cold War planners never anticipated, was about to transform the Greenland ice sheet from a reliable deep freeze into something far more unpredictable. And all that material left behind in 1967, all those thousands of tons of fuel and chemicals and contaminated waste, was about to become someone else's problem. The glacier that had swallowed Camp Century might not keep it forever after all. For decades after Camp Century was abandoned, the facility existed in a kind of convenient obscurity. The ice continued to accumulate, burying the crushed remains of the underground city deeper with each passing year. The Cold War eventually ended, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the strategic concerns that had driven the project faded into historical memory. Occasionally, researchers studying the Greenland ice sheet would reference Camp Century in their papers, noting its location and the scientific data that had been collected there. But the question of what had been left behind, all those thousands of tons of waste and equipment, rarely came up. Out of sight, out of mind. The glacier had swallowed the problem, and everyone seemed content to leave it that way. Then climate scientists started paying closer attention to what was happening in the Arctic, and the comfortable assumption that Camp Century would remain buried forever began to look considerably less certain. The numbers were alarming. Global temperatures were rising faster than anyone had predicted. The Greenland ice sheet, that supposedly permanent feature of the polar landscape, was losing mass at an accelerating rate. Meltwater was flowing off the glacier in quantities that would have seemed impossible just a few decades earlier. And buried somewhere beneath all that increasingly unstable ice was a toxic time capsule from the Cold War, waiting to be unsealed. The scientists who first raised the alarm about Camp Century's frozen waste were not household names, but their research would eventually force governments to confront a problem they had been happily ignoring for half a century. Dr. Henrik Larsen, a glaciologist at the University of Copenhagen, and Dr. Michael Patterson, a climate researcher from York University in Canada, published a study in 2016 that laid out the situation in stark terms. Using ice sheet models and climate projections, they calculated when Camp Century's burial site might begin to be exposed by surface melting. Their conclusion was sobering. By the end of this century, possibly sooner, the waste that had been left behind in 1967 could begin emerging from the ice. Let that sink in for a moment. We are talking about nuclear waste, PCBs, thousands of gallons of diesel fuel, sewage, and assorted industrial contaminants, all of which were dumped in an era when environmental regulations were more of a suggestion than a requirement. The assumption at the time was that this material would remain frozen essentially forever. But forever in climate terms turned out to be about 100 years, which is basically tomorrow in geological time, and alarmingly soon in political time. The frozen tomb was warming up, and nobody had made any plans for what to do when it started to open. The inventory of what lies beneath the ice is genuinely disturbing when you look at it closely. The Army's own records, fragmentary as they are, suggest that approximately 200,000 litres of diesel fuel were left in underground storage tanks. That is enough to fill about 50 standard tanker trucks, just sitting there in the ice, waiting for the containers to corrode and the fuel to leak out. Then there are the PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, industrial chemicals that were commonly used in electrical equipment during the 1950s and 1960s before their extreme toxicity became widely understood. PCBs do not break down in the environment. They accumulate in the food chain, causing cancer, immune system damage, and developmental problems in humans and wildlife. The amount left at Camp Century is unknown but certainly significant, given the scale of the facility's electrical systems. And then there is the radioactive waste. Now, the Army did remove the nuclear reactor itself, as we discussed. But operating a nuclear reactor generates contaminated materials, coolant water, filters, tools that came into contact with radioactive components, even the lead shielding that was hastily installed when radiation levels proved higher than expected. Some of this material was removed during the reactor's extraction, but not all of it. Exactly how much radioactive waste remains at Camp Century is unclear, because the records from that era are incomplete and the Army has been less than forthcoming about the details. What we do know is that the site has never been certified as radiologically clean, which is bureaucratic language for there's probably still radioactive stuff down there. The 2016 study by Larson and Patterson got considerable media attention, which is what happens when you publish research suggesting that Cold War nuclear waste might soon be leaking into the Arctic Ocean. The story had everything: secret military bases, nuclear contamination, climate change, international intrigue. It was practically designed to go viral. Suddenly, Camp Century was back in the news for the first time in decades, and the governments involved found themselves facing uncomfortable questions they had hoped would never be asked. The response was, shall we say, less than satisfying. The United States essentially shrugged and pointed out that Greenland was Danish territory, so any environmental problems there were Denmark's responsibility. The Danes acknowledged the issue but noted that they had never been fully informed about what the Americans were actually doing at Camp Century, particularly regarding Project Iceworm and its nuclear dimensions. Both governments expressed vague concern and a willingness to discuss the matter further at some unspecified future date. It was a masterclass in diplomatic buck-passing, with each side politely suggesting that the other should probably do something while neither committing to any concrete action. The follow-up research has only made the situation more concerning. In 2017, an international team of scientists conducted an expedition to the Camp Century site, equipped with ground-penetrating radar mounted on skis. Yes, skis. Because when you are trying to map a buried toxic waste dump in the middle of an Arctic ice sheet, you work with what you have. The radar allowed them to create detailed images of the subsurface structures without actually digging into the contaminated material, which would have been far too dangerous. What they found confirmed that the facility's remains are still there, compressed but largely intact, spread across an area roughly the size of 100 football fields. The scientists were explicitly forbidden from drilling into the waste itself. This was not excessive caution on anyone's part, it was basic safety protocol. Drilling into containers of unknown chemical and radioactive material that have been sitting in unstable conditions for 50 years is exactly the kind of thing that creates headlines like, "Scientists accidentally release Cold War toxins into Arctic." Environment. The radar survey could tell them where things were, but not the current condition of the containers or the extent of any leakage that might have already occurred. To get that information would require a much more extensive and expensive operation than anyone has yet been willing to fund. What the research has established is that the ice around Camp Century is warming faster than the broader Greenland ice sheet. This is partly due to local conditions and partly due to the general acceleration of Arctic warming that has climate scientists increasingly alarmed. The permafrost that was supposed to keep this material frozen forever is no longer permanent in any meaningful sense. Surface melting is occurring at elevations and latitudes where it was historically rare. The margin of safety that the Army assumed in 1967, all those centuries of accumulated snow that would bury the waste beyond any possibility of retrieval, is shrinking with each passing decade. To date, no radioactive contamination has been detected in the meltwater flowing from the Camp Century area. This is good news, as far as it goes, but it is also somewhat cold comfort. The fact that contamination has not been detected yet does not mean the site is safe. It means the containers have not failed yet, or that any leakage has not yet reached the surface. Given that we're talking about materials that have been under enormous pressure from compacting ice for over 50 years, subjected to temperature cycles and structural stresses they were never designed to withstand, the current integrity of those containers is essentially unknown. We are hoping for the best while having no real way to verify whether the best is actually what we are getting. This brings us to the political dimensions of the Camp Century legacy, which are almost as toxic as the physical waste buried under the ice. Greenland occupies a complicated position in the Danish constitutional framework. It is technically part of the Kingdom of Denmark, but it has its own parliament, its own government, and increasing autonomy in most areas of domestic policy. There is a significant independence movement in Greenland, driven by a desire for self-determination and by lingering resentment over centuries of Danish colonial rule. The discovery that Denmark allowed the United States to leave thousands of tons of hazardous waste on Greenlandic territory, without consulting the Greenlandic people or even informing them about the true nature of American activities, has not exactly improved relations. Former Greenlandic Prime Minister Astrid Hendrickson became one of the most vocal critics of Danish handling of the Camp Century issue. For years, she pressed Copenhagen for answers about what exactly had been left behind and what plans existed to deal with the potential environmental consequences. The responses she received were evasive at best. Danish officials acknowledged that they had limited information about Camp Century's contents, blamed the Americans for failing to share crucial details, and suggested that the matter required further study before any conclusions could be drawn. It was the kind of bureaucratic non-answer that politicians perfect over careers spent avoiding accountability. For Greenlandic independence advocates, Camp Century has become a powerful symbol of everything wrong with the colonial relationship. Here was a case where a foreign power with Danish complicity had used Greenlandic territory for secret military purposes, left behind a massive environmental hazard, and then essentially walked away from the problem. The people who would bear the consequences of any contamination, the Greenlandic communities who depend on the Arctic ecosystem for their traditional way of life, had never been consulted about any of it. Their land had been treated as a convenient dumping ground, and decades later they were still waiting for someone to take responsibility. The sovereignty questions raised by Camp Century extend beyond Greenland's relationship with Denmark. Remember, the United States was planning to deploy hundreds of nuclear missiles on Danish territory without bothering to inform the Danish government about Project Iceworm. This was not a minor oversight. It was a deliberate decision to use an ally's territory for purposes that ally had never approved, on the assumption that what they did not know would not hurt them. When the classified documents were finally released in the 1990s, Danish officials expressed appropriate diplomatic outrage, but the damage to trust had already been done. Washington's position has been to maintain classification on many Project Iceworm documents, citing national security concerns that seem increasingly tenuous, given that the project was abandoned over 50 years ago and the Cold War ended decades back. Critics argue that the real reason for continued secrecy is to avoid legal and diplomatic complications that might arise if the full extent of American activities in Greenland became public knowledge. There may be documents that detail exactly what was left behind at Camp Century, documents that could clarify the environmental risks and inform cleanup planning. But those documents remain locked away, accessible only to those with appropriate security clearances and a need to know. Meanwhile, the ice continues to warm. Every year brings new temperature records in the Arctic. Every summer sees more meltwater flowing off the Greenland ice sheet. The buried remains of Camp Century, that frozen monument to Cold War ambition and environmental negligence, inch closer to the surface with each passing season. Climate models suggest that the site could begin experiencing significant surface melting within the next few decades, possibly sooner if warming accelerates beyond current projections. When that happens, the toxic legacy of a project conceived in the 1950s will become a very present tense problem. The question of who bears responsibility for cleaning up Camp Century has no easy answer. The United States built the facility and left the waste behind, but on territory that was and remains under Danish sovereignty. Denmark permitted American military activities but claims ignorance of the full extent of those activities. Greenland is moving toward greater autonomy and may eventually achieve full independence, but inheriting a Cold War toxic waste site was not exactly on their national wish list. International law provides limited guidance for situations where allies create environmental hazards on each other's territory under the fog of Cold War secrecy. What seems increasingly clear is that someone will eventually have to do something. The ice will not wait for diplomats to sort out jurisdiction and liability. It will melt on its own schedule, releasing whatever it contains into the Arctic environment regardless of which government claims responsibility or how many committees are convened to study the issue. The legacy of Camp Century, that audacious attempt to build a city under the glacier and hide nuclear missiles in the frozen earth, will eventually emerge from the ice one way or another. The only question is whether humanity will be prepared when it does, or whether we will simply watch as the sins of the Cold War seep slowly into the sea.